by no means the least lecture, and I remind you that we are waiting for your questions and remarks at the end, is by Professor Tamar Dayan. Tamar is a professor of zoology and a Robert Rayner Chair for Environmental Conservation Research. Tamar is a leading scientist on biodiversity and environment in Israel. She is the director of the National Collection of Natural History at Tel Aviv University and chair of the Open Landscape Institute. Previously, she served as the head of the Institute for Nature Conservation Research at Tel Aviv University, chair of the Israel Man and Biosphere UNESCO Committee, chair of the board of directors of the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, and member of the board of directors of the Israel Nature and Parks Authority. Tamar is also member of a discussion group on sustainable development and biodiversity at the Israel Ministry of Environmental Protection. Professor Tamar will discuss the issue of population increase and the impact on biodiversity. Tamar, please.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. And as an ecologist, I anticipated, Paul, that you'll be a difficult act to follow. So I'll keep it short and qualitative because I was not wrong. And I will talk about population increase and biodiversity, and a lot of what I will be saying will be stating the obvious. Israel does have high species richness, high endemic species richness. It's currently under scientific debate if all taxa or not all taxa, but definitely this poster of the Ministry of Environmental Protection boasts and celebrates Israel biodiversity, which is high. And on the other hand, the risks, the threats are also high. Israel is part of the Eastern Mediterranean, like the entire circum-Mediterranean region, and in fact, all Mediterranean regions in the world is a biodiversity hotspot, meaning a high richness of local endemics, and on the other hand, high risk. So we have sharp climatic gradients, we have a wealth of diverse habitats, we're a biogeographic crossroads, and on the other hand, this biodiversity is seriously threatened now without population increase. The overriding reason, the ultimate reason, of course, for threats to biodiversity worldwide and in Israel is population growth. There's no escaping this fact. We all know it. It's not even contested. And I used a couple of old slides, several years old, from the Open Landscapes Institute, but we can see the population density in Israel, and particularly in the Mediterranean zone north of Beersheba. We can see that Israel is indeed very densely populated, and the statistics were already given. The rate of population growth is remarkably high for a Western country, and still very high, even if it is slightly slower than in the previous decade. This rate of population growth goes both in adding population density, but also comes with an increase in the standard of living. Again, the Open Landscapes Institute, thank you. And urban development in Israel, and we can see that from 48 to 2000, first 52 years of the State of Israel, a six-fold increase in density, and yet a 17-fold increase in the Mediterranean zone in built-up areas. And this is, of course, increasing with the increase in standard of living and population density. So we have to factor in both the increase in population and the increase in standard of living when we're talking about the effects on biodiversity. On the other hand, in red we see the protected areas, the nature reserves in the Mediterranean zone of Israel, and we can see they're few, far between, and a very low percentage of the State of Israel. So with all this as a backdrop, we can assume that we have already a very major challenge. And if I put together the specific challenges in the State of Israel, which probably are not don't only typify Israel, but still are ours as compared to some of the other countries of the world. It's a very small country, heavily populated, rapid population growth, a Western-level economy and standard of living, insufficient protected areas, and that's the terrestrial. I didn't even mark the marine, which is an even sadder story. War or hostilities, it's already been noted, bring to a feeling of instability. Instability affects both demography, and instability affects long-term considerations very adversely, as we all know. Limited water resources, in spite of this cheerful talk by Uri. Strong, incredibly strong development ethos. It's already been stated, a very strong agricultural ethos. This is what we all grew on. This is the essence of the state of Israel. An immigrant society with all its complexities, including a complex relationship with its natural environment. And again, a region with few connections, little science, little conservation. In terms of biodiversity, we do have fairly long borders, so we are affected by other countries and affect them in turn. But the effect on Israel, which is the edge effect of Israel, is fairly large in terms of conservation considerations, although frankly this was not so far a major issue in terms of our conservation. Threats to biodiversity in Israel are the same as the world over: habitat transformation, loss and fragmentation, invasive species, pollution of various types, overexploitation, and now climate change. It's the same series of threats worldwide, but some of them are seriously exacerbated here. If we want to subdivide and try and see a picture of how we affect the environment, or what habitat transformation, for example, is all about, it would be agriculture, which is indeed a very destructive land use, afforestation, which is sometimes a questionable land use, construction, urban sprawl, new settlements, roads, stone quarries, etc. Invasive species from varied intentional and unintentional sources. We'll talk about it a little in a minute. Pollution, some of which is now known, wetland pollution, coastal air, soil. They're dealt with, they can be dealt with, should be dealt with better, but are now on the agenda. Light pollution, which is not yet dealt with, is probably a major issue, especially in a country that equates security with artificial illumination. Overexploitation, to some extent illegal hunting and poaching, but the major cause or the major issue now would be the Eastern Mediterranean overexploitation of marine resources, which is now only beginning to be on the table as part of discussion, and clearly is ongoing and clearly should be dealt with. And then climate change, the beginning of which can already be seen in shift in species distributions, desertification, effects on wetland habitats, etc. And considering the strong gradient that we have, whatever the models that we rely on, climate change is here and is going to affect Israeli biodiversity. What we should all remember is that these threats often compound each other, often complicate the situation. What Paul termed nonlinear effects are very difficult to make clear expectations, can bring about extreme outcomes. And just to use the Eastern Mediterranean as a case in point, we have Lesepsian migration, whereby species from the Red Sea are crossing to the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal at alarming proportions. We have overexploitation and bottom trawling. We have climate change, Aswan Dam, prospecting for gas and oil, and I could add desalination plants, and I could add sewage effluents, etc. So all these together would be incredibly difficult to predict. Each would make the effects of others more significant, would be really difficult to make predictions, except we can say there's a huge change in the biodiversity of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. I think nobody would contest the statement that without major policy and cultural changes, it's a given that an increase in Israeli population will increase and exacerbate the human impact on Israel's ecosystems and contribute to their loss and degradation. I don't think this can be contested. I don't think there's a single Israeli scientist, or probably not land manager, who would argue this statement. For example, we can expect increased pressure on water resources. I hesitate to even say water now after the past talk, but I will say one thing. We all like to look at desalination plants as panacea for our problems in many ways. And probably for marine environments, both the brine and the chemicals associated have been underestimated in the past, and now there's research looking into that. So I'll be very happy to have drinking water in the next decades, and I realize the strength and significance, but all these need to be weighed against effects on biodiversity and on the environment. There'll be increased development, increase in infrastructures, which could be wonderful infrastructures like sewage reclamation plants, especially if they're improved, but even that are infrastructures. Increase in agricultural lands for local consumption, and probably in part also for export, because this is something that's, if we're talking sacred cows, definitely Israeli agriculture is one. Increased influx of exotic and potentially invasive species, increased pressure on open landscapes, even if for recreational purposes. In a really hot day, if you go to the beach, you can see that. If you can see that in closed nature reserves and holidays, we are a densely populated country. And of course, increased pollution of the various lights, organic, chemical light, increase in overexploitation, increased conflict over land ownership and use, which is not unique to our region, but affects biodiversity directly and indirectly. And I put in gray that these and others will compound the effects of climate change. We're not a great player in the climate change field in terms that we're not making a huge effect, but we need to pull our weight like other countries, even if for economic reasons. On the other hand, we will be impacted in our biodiversity in various complex and adverse ways, and all this will be compounded by all the other effects and many others. And I think all these are clear and can be anticipated. I will finish with 2 points. One is some of these impacts may be mitigated by major policy and lifestyle changes in planning, such as issues as construction and transportation and agriculture, natural resource management, afforestation, protected areas, terrestrial and marine, pollution control, etc. And we resource use at the personal level. We have an amazing opportunity in Israel, which we need to remember. First, we're a small country with a central government, which we may or may not like or appreciate or enjoy our administration, but it has power to do good to the state of Israel if it's so persuaded. We have master plans, national master plans for land, for water. We should have a master plan for energy. We have plans for agriculture. We have central effects on agriculture. Our land is publicly owned. Our water is publicly owned. Our natural resources are publicly owned, which means they can actually be managed intelligently if we so choose. And if our government so chooses, there is an opportunity for real action at the national level that can mitigate these effects. And of course, at the personal level of use, I enjoyed seeing your figure for home use of water in urban areas, Uli. I think there's a lot to be done there also, partly probably implemented by government-level decisions, but a lot as people. And one of our strengths is that we do have very active NGOs in Israel who are committed and involved in public education. Now, and here's just an example of 3 of our national plans. They're effective, they're important, they can be used. The question, of course, is will these measures suffice for the current situation and for the future? I think this is virtually impossible to answer in complex systems such as biodiversity. We're losing biodiversity now, and we will lose more as population increases. And even if we make all these policy and personal changes, which to my mind, we need to make now anyway, even if not a single Israeli is added to our population. These are things that we're we've put off too long. The change is only now beginning, too belatedly, but we can still do it, and I think we have no choice but to do it. Will these be effective in view of a growing population with two things make it difficult to say. One is, as we said, nonlinear effects, and the other is what is sufficient. What is the level that as a society we're willing to take as the biodiversity toll for development, and what will we not accept? My own personal sense, because personal senses have been shared, so I will share my own personal sense in that, and that is that if we want to make a change that will affect also demography, the changes should be through national resource management, natural resource management, in land and water or resources and many others, and by personal choices. And my sense is that if we do top-down and bottom-up, make the educational awareness, public perception, and administrative changes, demography will follow. The other route in the Middle East, I wouldn't be optimistic about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dayan. We concluded the lecture session. We break for 15 minutes. There is a snack waiting for you. In 15 minutes, we'll reconvene, and we are waiting for your questions and remarks.